One of the most striking involvements of Folkestone in the First World War was the great influx of Belgian refugees. War was declared on the 4th of August, and on the 21st of August the first batch of refugees arrived. That was to swell enormously. For instance, in 3 days in August, up to the 29th, 30th and 31st of August, in the region of just under 8,000 came through the harbour. On one day in October, after the fall of Antwerp, something like 16,000 people came through the harbour. The figure was given toward the end of the year of 54,500 people in total who had come through. By May 1915, the refugee committee which had been set up, a gentleman called Leonard Franklin came down from London, from the local government board, to take control of this new committee, which everybody admitted had been set up very, very quickly. He took control, and by May 1915 he was able to report that 100,000 Belgian refugees had been dealt with. They were met at the harbour by members of the refugee committee wearing an armband and a distinguishing badge, and then were taken to, after a medical examination that is, of course, they were then taken to various places, particularly the old Harvey Grammar School, where they were given something to eat, fresh clothing and a bed for the night. And then they were encouraged then to move on to London and other places. The net result being that by October, having handled over 100,000 people, only 2,000 residents, Belgians, were actually resident in the town, and that's including the administrative staff of the Belgian consul, etc. So there's an amazing amount of figures. But over 275,000 refugees are thought to have come through the town altogether, although the burden was relieved because later on, after about a year, some of them were diverted to Tilbury, relieving the pressure on Folkestone, because at one point the government said some of the refugees will have to move on from Folkestone because Folkestone's overwhelmed. By the end of the year of the war, in 1918, they were able to report that there were something like still 170,000 Belgian refugees in England, of which 60,000 were in and around the London area, of which 80% of them were actually in work. Some 40,000 of them were employed in the munitions industry, because a lot of people complained that the Belgians were being looked after and doing nothing, and it wasn't the case, as a large number of them went into munitions. What about the children? Well, we know for a fact that they tried to keep families together, but there were occasions when children were brought in by people, the relatives that had been killed, or they asked them to bring them in, take them with you, save my son, what have you, and some of them were then found adoption throughout the country, often through local churches, particularly the Baptists and the Methodists and what have you, found places for these orphan children. So at the end, so by 1918, Folkestone had certainly handled over 200,000 Belgian refugees, and the Belgians were so grateful that they actually presented a plaque to the town, and 116 of them signed an address to the mayor. The committee itself, put together very quickly. Mr. Franklin was eventually recalled to London because it was considered that he'd done the job that was needed, and Mr. Toke, who was the town clerk, with a couple of officers from the French and the Belgian army and some local ladies, carried on with the great work of looking after all these Belgian refugees.